A lot of the work, I read it, I understand it, I move forward from a vision standpoint, and then I'm maybe not as good as explaining why we're doing these things and what they mean. Flourishing is a state that we flow in and out of in community with one another, an interrelationship and interconnectedness from a system standpoint. And so it's not a checkbox, right? We don't get to this state of flourishing and then it sustains itself. It's consistent work that we need to do over time, intentionally and in concert with one another, to establish the conditions for each of us to feel like we have purpose and are well at work and in our workplace.
I get a little bit tired sometimes when I hear people talk about or suggest that education hasn't changed. It's the same. It's not the same. It is very different. And today's guest, Dr. Christopher Fuzessy, really embodies a lot of what is very different about today's leaders, today's schools. He and the school division in Foothills is focused on this notion of flourishing and being well at work. And that is not something that was ever a conversation or discussed in any kind of systemic way, certainly when I began teaching. And so these are, I think, part of the big shifts. And not only is it not just talk, but as you hear in our conversation, really attempting to figure out what does that actually mean, understanding that's a hard thing to do. This is not an easy work. And so I really appreciate leadership like Christopher who are embracing some of these challenges. And I think even throughout this conversation, you'll hear also a sense of humility in his approach, and that he feels like he knows all the answers and is very open to the fact that he's trying to learn along in this journey. Those kinds of qualities, I believe, are really very different from education and leadership 20, 30 years ago. I think there is a shift and a change. And I know that for some people, not many, but for some people that is frustrating because it's not, here's the thing we're going to do. We're just going to go do it. And we're very regimented and widget driven, I guess, in terms of the success and the focus of it being on test scores and those kinds of metrics. So I'm so grateful for the fact that we do have leaders like Christopher leading the work, who are understanding the complexity of our time and the role that we play and the sustainability really of this work. So enjoy my conversation today as we talk about flourishing with Dr. Christopher Fuzessy, superintendent of Foothills School Division in High River, Alberta. I picked up some on my reading, and this part that I think intrigues me, is that you have that Foothills School Division has an F word.
Yes.
What's your F word?
Shoulder here. It's flourish. We adopted that word into our vernacular, if you will, probably about 4 years ago, and it was based on a lot of reading. I do read a lot. It's a hobby, I suppose. And in looking at leadership literature and associated literature, moving in the direction of flourishing based on Martin Seligman's work, I'll say way back, but he wrote a book called Flourish. But looking at that more recent regenerative leadership research, this topic kept coming up, this theme kept coming up, moving towards flourishing. And what does flourishing mean? So I appreciate that you characterized it that way, because that's language I've used within the system. It's the Foothills F word from the standpoint of it's recognized, people have heard it, and I bring it up often enough, and it's built into our policy framework and AP framework enough that it can have a reaction like, he's on about flourishing again. Having said that, people recognize it. They understand, for the most part, the direction that we're moving to. And I describe it and have learned over the years, in response to some of what I just described, that helping people develop a deeper understanding of that concept is important, because a lot of the work, I read it, I understand it, I move forward from a vision standpoint, and then I'm maybe not as good as explaining why we're doing these things and what they mean. Flourishing is a state that we flow in and out of in community with one another, an interrelationship and interconnectedness from a system standpoint. And so it's not a checkbox, right? We don't get to this state of flourishing and then it sustains itself. It's consistent work that we need to do over time, intentionally and in concert with one another, to establish the conditions for each of us to feel like we have purpose and are well at work and in our workplace.
And again, I recently did a keynote where I talked about AI and human flourishing. We'll get into AI in just a second. I'm with you in the idea that words can get, I think there's a lot of words in education that get used, and then at some point they just lose their effectiveness because they can mean everything to everybody and they become too broad. In our efforts to bring people together, the word loses its nuance and specificity. And I think there's some specificity within the word flourishing that perhaps positions it slightly different than maybe well-being, maybe belonging, which again are all part of it 100%. But I wonder if you can speak to some of that nuance of like when you think of the word flourishing, first of all, as an individual, what that actually looks like and feels that might single it out as being like, that's why we're using this word.
That's a great question. I'll go to a couple of pieces of research that help define that for me. Wall Kimmerer wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and near the conclusion, she's an Indigenous scholar. She uses this phrase, and I'm quoting here, flourishing is mutual. So it can't happen in isolation. We talked more recently at Foothills School Division about community, which is the manifestation, if you will, or the pragmatic operationalization of flourishing. So to get to this state of being able to flourish, we need to live in community and rely on one another. And here's where I'll add a little bit more from a research-driven perspective. As I read Michael Ungar's most recent book, The Limits of Resilience, and he reframes the term resilience, to your point in terms of language is important, away from bouncing back and frames it as stepping back. And when we step back, what are the redundant systems of support that exist around us in order to allow us to continue on? And so when I think about defining that as a system and personally, it's about the interconnections, the purpose that we bring to the work, and in collaboration with one another in accomplishing the work, in alignment with the system's goals and values, and tapping into this sense of community, whether that be the school community itself, your colleagues, the parent community that you serve, the larger Foothills County community that we all exist within. How do we bring those structures in as those redundant support structures that help us accomplish our core purpose, which is teaching and learning? Final thought on that. I've said to a few people recently, in reflecting on the work I do, I find myself doing a lot of work that isn't directly related to teaching and learning. And when I think about that, and is that a misguided application of my time, I come back to the conclusion that if students aren't available to learn and staff aren't available to bring their best, then if we create this community system around them that allows us all to access that interconnected flourishing, then I'm doing the right work so that we do get to the place of focusing on teaching and learning as our core purpose in concert with these other redundant systems that can provide some of that additional support that is necessary in today's context, because it's a more difficult world that we navigate these days.
It is, and I always point to, and I was having a conversation on Friday with a member, an MLA in Saskatchewan, and there was a reference to the idea that I think schools need to, I can't remember, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but the idea that schools should be much more about preparing kids for the world of work and so forth. And while I listen and I go, yeah, I don't disagree, that's part of our mission. I think that part of that idea was predicated on a model that existed 50 or 70 years ago, where we assumed, right or wrong, that their emotional and psychological and spiritual and all these other parts of the human were taken care of at home. So all we had to do in education was simply provide them with a knowledge base and a skill base for them to be successful in the world of work. But I would argue that probably we were a little bit misguided initially thinking that was happening. And now today, even more, another thing is even more, there are fewer kids that have that support. And then the third component of that is our research has led us to believe that you can't focus on the teaching and learning by itself in isolation of who you are as a person. So all of those factors come to say, yeah, we have to do that. The other thing I want to just maybe touch on, you said this, and this is becoming more and more kind of a part of my own sort of work and learning, is you said resilience is an opportunity, is to step back rather than step forward. And that stepping back, in my mind, speaks to a bit of a slowing down. Let's not just rush to the next thing. Let's slow down and examine where we've come from, what has happened to us, how we got to where we are, so that we can bring people together to say, where do we go from here? So I don't know if that idea of slowness or slowing things down has become part of your leadership of late, because I think it's something that people are actually looking to. Who can slow the train down because it's moving so fast?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept and one I've thought about. Just to add a little context, when Michael Ungar speaks about that, I'm pretty confident that I remember this accurately, so I'll say it. He's talking about the etymology of the word and tracing it back to classical times, and that's where that original, I guess, definition of resilience comes from. Having said that, we're fortunate here in Alberta to have teaching quality standards, leadership quality standards, superintendent leadership quality standards, and there's an element in common. There's lots of elements in common across them, but one of them is reflective practice. So that's something I've been talking about here for some time. Where are the opportunities for reflection? How do we build that into our professional learning? For example, as a system responsibility, but also inviting colleagues to consider where is that space that they can find for themselves. And that looks different for every individual. Workplace well-being, we're starting to talk now more about wellness in the workplace and not well at work from the standpoint of individual well-being as an individual responsibility. Creating the conditions and work for people to opt in and be well is a system responsibility. So what I'm referring to there in reflective practice is what's the interplay between those two things. So for example, I make a conscious choice to get up at 5:30, do some reading, do some journaling, and center myself for the day in that regard. If there's something I'm wrestling with professionally, I might write about it and make sense of it at that point in time. That isn't necessarily a winning formula for everyone, right? So is it a trusted colleague? Is it a thought partner? What does that look like so that we carve out that space to step back and find time to think and make connections in that way, which I think gives us the space to go off and do some of the more challenging work. That could be instructional leadership. It could be difficult conversations. It could be leadership in general at times. But yeah, that stepping back piece and slowing down, I think there's value in that professional reflection aspect of it. What that looks like, to reiterate for each individual, is for them to dedicate time to and to figure out. Though we have a system responsibility in creating structures around it too.
Yeah, I want to get back to the system a little bit, but since you mentioned it, I'd like to build off this. So you recently wrote a book called Emanate.
Yeah, I did.
And where I think you talk a little bit about this idea of self-reflection and kind of, so maybe just for, again, I haven't read the book, so I don't know, but give me a bit of an overview that helps understand how you took, and maybe if I'm getting this right, taking your own sort of personal journey around this and have taken that to apply it to the larger system, whether it's Foothills or just generally speaking. So yeah, just share a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks. I'll characterize it as a deeply self-reflective book that I didn't wrestle with. How can I put this? The decision to make it available wasn't one I wrestled with outside of the fact that it's deeply self-reflective. And the reason I put it out there in the end is because if there's a kernel of information in there that helps people on their own leadership journey, then it would be worth putting it out into the larger society. It chronicles a lot. I'll put it differently. It chronicles a journey from post-pandemic, trying to make sense of leadership in that time, to the present, and ends on the theme of community, which we're operationalizing now in our system. So there's a lot of interplay between what I wrote about there, the reflections that I share there, and how it manifests in the work that I lead from a professional standpoint. The other connect there is part of the post-publishing piece in looking at well-being in the workplace or workplace wellness was a little bit of upstream thinking, if I can put it that way. And I say that with humility because maybe it's not that upstream. Is if we take the leap of, if we put systems and structures in place for our leadership team to be as well as possible in their work, does that then set them up to be as available as possible to support staff and support students, which the end result of that is optimum teaching and learning from a student standpoint. So we've partnered with the University of Calgary, and we're in the process of looking at what does an effective leadership support framework look like. They've done some interviews with many of our staff, our leadership team, on a volunteer basis. And they also did an environmental scan of what does well-being for leadership and education look like nationally. I don't have the results of that yet. They're working through that. But the one thing that they have shared, because I'm doing a piece at CAS later this week, the CAS conference on this, is that the maybe theoretical is the wrong way to characterize it. What's present in environmental scan from published and publicly available documents across school jurisdictions in Canada in terms of what that looks like, and what has come from initial teasing out of interviews with some of our leaders doesn't necessarily align, in that the theory looks different than what people are expressing they would need to see in practice. I can't really go past that because I don't have any data that goes deeper than that. But what it did do in reflecting on that as an outcome from your original question, where did the book lead? It led to this work, and it also validates, at least in theory right now, the research results, the directions that we're trying to go in as an individual organization in concert with our professional judgment and research informed and data informed in taking those steps. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I mean,
No, yeah, no, that's kind of what I was looking for and again, I appreciate people that are willing to share kind of their personal journey without necessarily being able to provide a strict roadmap for anybody.
right.
Like these are just ideas that can be useful. I do want to go back though, because I think there may be something in that just referencing this back to this concept of flourishing. And I wonder if you have any examples. And again, I know this is not something that's a short-term kind of a goal. This is long-term, but I just wonder if you have examples of existing communities, school communities in Foothills right now that you could point to as, even if it's a small thing that says that's an example of what we're getting at, especially in this larger community piece, as opposed to flourishing as individuals, but as a community. What is an example of a school community that is moving towards this idea of flourishing?
I can give a couple of examples there in different ways. We've got an elementary school that has probably, well, how can I put this? A very engaged parent council and larger parent volunteer group. So many opportunities are available to students as a result of that, because you've got people who are coming into the school, trusted individuals. The bottom line, I've often said in advancing this work most recently, and there's nuance here, but we need to make sure insurance is in place, and we need to make sure police checks are in place. From that standpoint, further or forward, where are the barriers we can remove? So in this example, very involved parent community meets that grants are being written. Theater productions are coming into the school. Concerts are coming into the school, relying a lot on that parent volunteerism and enriching the culture of learning in the school as a result. There's also a lot of opportunity for families to come into the school at parent-student dances and things of that nature. So that's a great example of tapping into the parent aspect of community. We have a high school that's a 7 to 12 that really has advanced this work tremendously with local business and local service groups in their community. And so they have a vertical garden, it's called. No, it's not a vertical garden. It's more or less a garden in a shipping container with state-of-the-art equipment that was donated to the school. A lot of opportunity there that they've tapped into. The greens that are raised in that shipping container, I'm not using the right terminology here, but they're sold at the local grocery store, for example. They're sold at the market in an adjacent community during the summer. Students are volunteering for community events like the Christmas lights, for example. By virtue of doing that, getting to know business owners in the community who are then involved in this virtuous circle of, now we have a need for an employee. There are a number of students who have come and volunteered, and it's increasing capacity in that way. So elementary school is more of a parent-driven community. This is more of a business and service group, as I said, leveraging of community and opportunity, which directly connects with curriculum, so that students in the upper high school grades are exploring business, they're exploring marketing, they're exploring opportunities in agriculture, and it gets them credits both from a volunteer as well as a independent course perspective. And then I can think of some of our more rural locations where The manifestation of community is seen more in what's a K-8 configuration. The students are moving on to grade 9. The gym is full of a series of tables where family, friends, former teachers are coming to celebrate these students. But parents are giving speeches, students are giving speeches, teachers are giving speeches, and it's that collaboration between all those different shareholders that has enriched the education in that students' lives or those students' lives over the course of their time at the school. And so 3 different iterations, but there's something special in, and you may have had this experience in your own work, there's something special and different in rural education than what we see in urban education. Because in prior aspect of my career, I was working in the suburbs of Montreal and out towards the Ontario border, much more concentrated in terms of population, if you will. More opportunity for community to develop in that way in rural areas of our province here, just south of Calgary, and that in some of these equity of opportunity that is available to our students because we're tapping into that community that surrounds the school to provide those opportunities in concert with the teachers and the leaders in the school.
No, those are excellent. And I think a lot of people sometimes miss even seeing not just the opportunities, but calling out those opportunities for what they are, because they just see them as a surface. Oh, that's great that your kids are creating a garden and selling it. So they're looking at it purely from a practical experience, which it is. And it's great to be able to actually do something that matters. But I think the part you mentioned about connecting with other people in the community and building relationships, and there's the flourishing idea, which is what I originally asked you, I think is sitting right there in terms of that's what this is. This is me. This is us together accomplishing something, feeling like we're making something more than just what we do as individuals.
Yeah.
Those are,
If I may add to that,
yeah.
I mentioned this before. We live in a more complex world in the last decade or so. The only place we have agency and control, if you will, if I can call it that, is within our local communities. What happens at
Right.
the larger societal level, provincial, national, global, is not something that's within our sphere of influence. So from that redundant support system standpoint, if we have that agency and we have that potential reach as an organization, whether that be the school as the organization, the school division as the organization, or the classroom, and we tap out into that larger community and create those redundant support systems. Go back to what I said before from Robin Wall Kimmerer, flourishing is mutual. It doesn't happen in isolation. So I think there's a responsibility to move in this direction, especially in today's world.
100%. And to, I think, call that out to kids, saying, just so you know, kids, you don't need to be paying attention all the time to what's happening across the border or overseas and getting those things, because the number of kids that call out that as being, whether it's in a climate change or political strife that's causing anxiety amongst people, is pretty evident. And I think what you're describing is what I would call the anecdote to all this, and that is to be involved in your local community and make a difference with, and you can actually see. And also I think that creates a direct link to your local politics, which you do have more influence over. So whether it's your trustees or whether it's your local city councilors or RMs or whatever piece it is, that you can actually go up to that person and say, hey, I mentioned talking with an MLA last week. That has much more of an impact than me reading about what's happening in Iran or in the US or even in our own country. That all that does is designed to create more anxiety and strife within me. So I think the things that you're talking about have multiple benefits beyond just the actual thing that it's doing, is by framing it to say, but do you see here, you're structuring the opportunity to live a life in this community and make a difference with the people. And you can see tangibly what happens when you invest in these kinds of experiences. So I think it's tremendous what you're describing.
Yeah, I recount a moment in the final chapter of the book I wrote where I'm trying to think about what is the next direction to take? How do we move forward with positivity around vision, for example? And I was reading a book at the time by a gentleman named Shane Parrish called Clear Thinking. And he poses a question in the book around problem solving and suggests, this could be debated, as could everything, the merits of the following question as the best starting point to solve a problem. And the question is, what would have to be true in order for this problem to have never existed? And when I thought through that, I kept coming back to this concept of community, division, if you will, differences in opinion, strong feelings about different topics, right or wrong. If we come together as a community, I think it speaks to communication. It speaks to respect for differences. It speaks to understanding one another a little bit more deeply and perhaps walking away with, we can agree to disagree, but what we do have in common here is providing great opportunities for students to strengthen our future community. So
Yeah.
let you know in a half decade how this work goes.
Yeah, no, I think you might see more fruit faster than that, I think. But I think your point, like that, you look back, I don't know, I grew up in a rural community in Manitoba, and there were people who disagreed with lots of things, but because they spent a lot more time together in civic and religious and athletic pursuits, whatever those would be, you were shoulder to shoulder with people all the time.
Right.
And so you saw them as humans who just thought a little differently than you did, and that's fine. Like
Yeah.
we'll figure it out and then
Great.
end. So anyway,
That's the hope.
yeah, this isn't even shifting gears because I think it's part of this piece, but I know the degree to which Foothills has many dipped their toe in the world of AI and trying to figure out what role AI plays, even towards this idea of human flourishing and keeping that as the fore. And I think I've been grateful to work with so many school districts who, as they've engaged in this work, they haven't done it because they're trying to add a new thing, because that's just going to drive people nuts. But they're trying to figure, how does this fit in with our current ethos, with our current values, and how might it enhance and amplify, and also paying attention to how it might potentially threaten our beliefs. So I know you have, I think, started creating even this thing called an FSD assistant, if you will. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about kind of your AI journey and the specifics. Just again, and no need to apologize that you haven't got it all figured out, because no one has. In fact, if you did have it, say it all figured out, I'd be very concerned, because I don't think that's possible. But anyway, just your story around that, and even this idea of an assistant and how that might lead towards some increased flourishing.
I'll bring us back to the first time I recall AI being brought up in the system was in those early days of ChatGPT, and I forget which version being introduced, and some questions coming to us from community and internal discussions around, should we develop a policy that says, no AI, those kinds of conversations. And in our education plan, we talk about innovation and continuous improvement. So that seemed like the wrong reaction. We decided to learn more about it. I did my own reading on it, read 4 or 5 books. I am certainly not the expert in organization on this topic by any means. But at our opening day for us, we're a small enough system, we can bring every employee, 900, together in a gym at the beginning of the year and message out. I talked a little bit that year about the opportunity that might exist within AI. And what that did in hindsight was gave our team members tacit permission to explore and to begin their own learning journey. And there's much more sophisticated technology in the system out there than me. And those folks went forward and they started doing that. And so what we've done essentially is leveraged it in such a way that we're trying to see where is the best opportunity to create in-house for the most part. And there are AI security reasons for that. We work currently as a Microsoft shop, so we're using Copilot, and we're assured that the data we put in is internal. It doesn't go outwards, while still being careful not to put nominative data into those agents that we're creating. And so what has that led to? It's led to opportunity to automate process in such a way that it creates time to focus on the human interaction in the work, or the positive professional relationship aspect of the work. So we've got 4 or 5 different current agents, if you will, that have been created in-house. One is called CART, which is comment and reporting tool. And so as a teacher, I can put my thoughts into this. Chris is having a little bit of difficulty in math, and this would be an accurate representation of me. His attention tends to wander at times, but he's got a decent grasp of the material. This agent takes what I've put in, but does the grammar and the spell check and all of those things. But it also aligns with our division framework for learning, which is learning that transfers. It aligns with the curricular expectations that we've put in on the backside of this agent, and it creates a consistency of comments. This is not a must do. It's a voluntary piece that teachers can opt into at their discretion, but they're assured that the comments that come out are in alignment with those provincial expectations, division expectations, and are polite, kind, and respectful in tone. Sometimes in conveying report card comments, we have concerns, it can be a challenge to word that in an appropriate way. So that's one example. We also leveraged AI in creating lesson plans, probably the best way to put it, with some of the new curriculum that's arrived in Alberta. We had a working group that worked through the first few weeks of July last year, and it can automate, if you will, that lesson planning component. So you spend your time in the area of passion in the work, which is fine tuning, as opposed to spending your time building the initial piece that you're going to be working on. Again, because we're working in-house and internally, all of the documents that were fed in for this agent to consider are ones that we have faith in, that our government documents, our internal documents. So we know that the product is going to align with our instructional model once again. We're looking at that from a teacher and a teacher leader evaluation standpoint as well. The LQS, or the Leadership Quality Standard, the Teaching Quality Standard. How can we create an app that's on our phone, which is in development right now? So, and doing my work as a leader in a school and supervising teachers during the course of the year, as I leave the class, I can open an app, put in a quick today's date, here's what I observed. And then anytime during the school year, I can download all of those observations. And at any point that I'm ready to, it will build it into an evaluation document that, again, on the backside, we structured in such a way that is in alignment with all of our policies, all of our administrative procedures. Then I'm spending a half hour to an hour fine tuning that document, making sure it's representative of the observations as opposed to spending my time collating it. So short answer to your question is we're trying to leverage it to create more opportunity to spend time in positive professional relationships and less time in process.
Any early feedback so far from folks?
Yeah, appreciative of the things that we've done thus far. Still some reticence for a variety of reasons, sustainability reasons, ethical reasons. I want to author everything that I write, for example, which I respect.
Sure.
The other thing that we're currently doing is in advancing that community or that flourishing work, we've just brought a group of 5 different working groups together of parent volunteers. We're doing this with some students in 10 to 12 and also with some parents in the community. But one of the working groups has been around AI and emerging technology. And what is it that we need to do differently as a school system in order to maybe surface the systems that aren't working in our organization and change the way we do things moving forward? Some interesting feedback from a student, for example, a couple of weeks ago was, I want to know how the businesses in the community are using AI. I want to be able to understand that so that I can fine tune my own understanding, so that when I graduate from high school or I choose to go on to post-secondary, I've got a skill set that business is looking for, or that my future employer might be looking for. There are moments in your career where you stand and you listen and you go, that's profound, and I really should have thought of that. That was one of those moments. And so we're gathering that information right now in order to advance what we're going to do in this respect in AI. And the other thing that we're doing is we've worked with our trustee team, we've worked with our school leadership team, and also our system leadership team to develop a vision for AI at the school division that we're then going to codify into probably administrative procedure, not necessarily policy, but it's very flexible in that it's not you will and won't do. It's we need to consider teaching and learning. We need to consider administrative burdens. We need to consider what parents want to see with this emerging technology and how do we weave that into the work. No, we haven't got it all figured out. It's very much in process and it continues to change over time. But that's some of what we've done in the last couple of years.
No, I appreciate that. And again, I think the things you're sharing are definitely resonate with me and things that I've generally been trying to help other divisions and school districts try to figure out and make it work for them, whether you're an urban or rural community, whatever your context is, you have to take that. I think there's a couple things though that as you were talking about the student's perception about what he wanted, I think there's been a couple of, in my experience, I would say when it comes to the parent and outside aspect of this, 2 things that were somewhat unexpected, I think, when we first started doing this work. First was when I start doing parent nights. And of course, as you probably are in lots of cases, always concerned that parents might come in with an axe to grind or something that they're going to present us with that we haven't thought of, which in all these cases has not been the case. But what was surprising is the number of parents who were asking the schools to help them understand and learn AI better. So here's like this opportunity. All right, you're always asking, you're intentionally working towards bringing folks together. I'm trying to make the case for those districts that haven't been as proactive in that space is you have an opportunity to take advantage of this inquisitiveness by many of your parents who want to understand AI better. And in the same way you're trying to figure it out, we'll bring them as part of this and we'll
Right.
learn this together. So that's one. And then the second piece was as people are starting to build use cases within their own school divisions is going outside and finding use cases within your parent community because you already have parents who are using AI as part of their work. And so this young man's query around, tell me what this looks like. Yes, there are examples of not just what skills they need, but the ways in which AI is being used right now in
Yes.
businesses right across your community, which then to me is really important for our particular high school students right now to have a lot more conversations, even though we don't know the answers around what does this mean for my future? Not just in terms of what are the industries that again, there's lots of data out there that would suggest this industry, that industry, whatever. And again, it's a lot to parse through. But again, I'm just inviting people to say, don't be, just because you don't know the answer, don't be afraid of the conversation. Like your kids are asking these questions. They want to know. And even if you say, I don't know, but let's talk about it. Let's bring in some people and start to build our own understanding collectively, which is, again, I think a rare opportunity in education when you have something that comes along that you are learning with and from one another, as opposed to the school figured out and then we'll tell everybody else everything about it. That's not how this works
Oh,
at
no,
all.
agreed. Not at all. It's we're all learning together and implementing in a certain way together while looking at guardrails, right? What is
Yes.
responsible use? We need to pay
Yeah.
attention to that. What is data security? We certainly need to pay attention to that. But within those guardrails, how do we work together
Right.
to help support students and their futures? It reminds me a little bit, not to play on the topic of flourishing, but we looked at the OECD framework for human flourishing in education, adaptive problem solving, agency, critical thinking, applying that skill set to the evolution of AI, if I can put it that way, within our school system is really where our work has been centered thus far. And now it's starting to, as you just pointed out, ripple out into more conversation with students and more conversation with parents, assuring we're attuning to needs, but also assuring that we've got the right guardrails in place all along. Because as things evolve, maybe we need to revisit guardrails along the way. So yeah,
Totally.
it's an interesting opportunity that seems different than Google and it seems different than Chromebooks and
100%.
seems different than iPads and their implementation over time.
Yeah, and definitely this is something that we're not trying to at any point any this isn't somebody to blame or what, this is a thing that's happening to us. And so the more we figure out how to do this together, as opposed to again, no teacher, no leader, nobody should be doing this by themselves. This is just way too complex to try to figure out on your own. That said, hey, let's welcome people's perspectives. For those that say I don't want to use it, that's fine. We can
Yeah.
work with that. That's not a threat to anybody who's curious about it. In fact, it's that might be a helpful person to have as they share some of their worries and issues. Yeah, I'm just very excited about doing the work because I think the opportunities that it affords us, not just the AI itself, but the way it can help us shape communities as a result if we do this effectively. And that sounds like what you've built some of that foundational stuff that really positions you well, I think, in this conversation.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's great. We're muddling through.
Yeah. No, as is everybody. As is everybody. No, nobody can speak to much more clarity than that. So I just shifting gears slightly. I do want to talk about, and again, you have a colleague who is, if I got my geography, a little southeast of you in Lethbridge. Tom Hamer
Yeah.
has a similar trajectory of you because he
Yeah.
came from Quebec as well.
Yeah.
And so what are these Quebec boys doing in Alberta? Number one, I just want to know how you got here. You touched on it a little bit. You said we were maybe looking to wait for a little different experience. So maybe that's part of it. But also in having that depth of experience in Quebec education, how you have navigated the similarities and differences between Quebec and Alberta when it comes to K-12 education.
It's interesting you talked about Tom. Tom, I think, left Quebec before me.
He did, yeah.
And there were a series of connections between Tom, another colleague that we both worked with, that he worked with at Eastern Township School Board, and myself all coming west. And it has to do with being connected into search consultants, essentially, and getting phone calls. So I got a call that this job was upcoming. It wasn't advertised yet, but that's through those professional connections, if you will, and gave me an opportunity to talk with our family. And had a couple of family meetings about this. It's a big move. We have 3 children. My wife is a teacher, had been working in a system with permanence. And we decided when the phone call came in that I was the successful candidate that we would take the opportunity. What precipitated that? I've always been one to think about systems from a what's next standpoint. How can I contribute at the next level, if you will, or in the next job? What prompted me to go from teaching to vice principal and any other roles that I've held has always been partially motivated by that. And also a desire to maybe, how can I put this diplomatically? Quebec is a great place, lovely people there. Our values weren't necessarily aligning with the larger societal context at the time. And so we wanted to give our kids more opportunity outside of the province, is probably the bottom line. They do or are bilingual, with the exception of our youngest who left in his grade 1 year. So he's lost some of that French over time. And having 2 languages is more of an asset elsewhere. And so we landed here. There's a bit of an anecdote association to that too, in terms of my daughter had been watching a television show called Heartland, and it's partially filmed here in High River over my shoulder, one of the buildings or the back of one of the buildings where it's filmed. But in watching that show with her, one day a Foothills School Division bus picked up the students and took them off to school. And my family doesn't remember this, but I remember it, saying, I want to work there one day. And that precipitated me looking at the organization, looking at their website, seeing who they were. And they've got a very strong history and tradition of innovation and excellence in education. And so that drew me here. I actually applied 3 times, third time lucky, landed at this job. So that's the context of all of the different factors that played in. I remember when I got the phone call and they said, we'd like to offer you the job. My response was, are you serious? I honestly came away from that interview process thinking, I'm not getting that job. Here we are, it's 7 years later, and we've become part of the fabric of the community here. And one of the differences, to go back to your question, or I shouldn't say differences, one of the more pleasant surprises, if you will, not that we had reticence to move, because we wouldn't have, was there's a deeper sense of community here than in the East. That's maybe because we moved from the suburbs to a more rural area. People have been very gracious, welcoming, kind. One of the things I've learned since is that, this is hypothetical on my part, speculating, but say 50% of Albertans are not born in Alberta. People from across Canada, BC, Saskatchewan, Ontario, out to Newfoundland, choose to settle here. And so maybe that's part of it too. It's a Canadian experience in one province. We haven't necessarily regretted it, aside from not anticipating the challenges of my wife leaving permanent teaching position and then starting over, if you will, a little bit later in her career. In hindsight, maybe that wasn't the best decision overall, but she has settled in and found her way that way too. So no regrets.
How do you think, when you think about just the way maybe the politics of education specifically, again, and having been working pretty closely with English Quebec, I always characterize English Quebec as being like the ugly stepchild of education in Quebec, because they're not treated very well, relatively speaking, for maybe obvious reasons. But I just wonder how you work obviously very directly with government here in Alberta, and that's part of your job.
Yep.
Like, how do you compare those sort of relationships that you had with, in terms of funding and those kind of things, but just even more the day-to-day interactions you might have with provincial governments and ministries of education, or even working with your colleagues through CAS and versus the Quebec model?
There's a lot in there. So if I forget one, let me know.
All right.
It's an interesting question. Around the time that, or maybe the year or two prior to our decision as a family to move west, there was some restructuring in the Minister of Education world in Quebec, and they removed middle managers, if you will. So, the Montreal office, if you will, had people who were assigned to different school boards. So if you had a question, you could ask that question and you'd get a fairly timely answer. that can be debated. So they removed that layer, and they wanted, I guess the intent, I should say, is more direct interaction directly into the ministry offices. That didn't necessarily make the work more expedient. You can ask questions at times, and then folks need to go off and find answers. And then by the time that answer comes a month or so later, you've advanced some of the work and you have follow-up questions, and it turns into a bit of a rut, if you will, in terms of getting timely response. So one of the differences I find is that there's more timely response here, whether working with CAS, whether working with Alberta Education. There's a series of deputy ministers here, and there's also field services managers who are zoned across the province, if you will. When I make those calls, if I need information, typically I'm getting that answer pretty quickly, and relationships are good. Regardless of the direction that different provinces choose to take in education, the relationships are solid, and there's timely access to information that helps us implement things more effectively and more easily. So that would be one of the differences that I've seen. It may also be because overall it's a smaller province from a population base, and maybe it's just easier to build those relationships because there's less to manage. I don't pretend to understand the complexities of a provincial budget nor of the Alberta education decision-making framework. My frame of reference is our local organization, but there's probably something in there that speaks to those better developed relationships. And we can walk away from things not necessarily agreeing, but we're implementing and we've got the information we need to action things. Now, I'm not sure I answered you there. One more thing I'll say is, CAS as a professional organization, I remember being part of CASA, Canadian Association of School System Administrators, when I was in Quebec, and going to some board meetings and listening to the people representing CAS and thinking to myself, that sounds like a solid organization. That's been my experience since moving here. Not to detract from SQ back east.
Yeah.
But you characterized it before. The English-speaking education community is much smaller in Quebec. And I think scaling that up here in Alberta, there's 61 separate and public school divisions and Francophone school divisions. You've got a critical mass of knowledge and skills that really helps support school system superintendents and school system leaders across the province. They're excellent at professional learning, have some great conferences, and there's a big emphasis on stories of practice. So how do we learn from one another in the things that we're doing and tap into the expertise and knowledge of the smart people in the room? Because the wisdom is in the room. It's not in any individual that sits within the room. So CAS as an organization, I would highlight as exceptional in that sense. It's been a great organization to come into.
That's great to hear. And I think when I think about the various sister organizations in other provinces, whether it's Leeds in Saskatchewan or BCSSD and so forth, you wonder how culture starts and why does CAS have this particular emphasis on, you talked about stories of practice and things of that nature. That's the interesting study of, like, everybody would like maybe to have that one, but I think about Quebec, seems like they're focused on navigating the funding issues that they might have. And so you get distracted from maybe other things, and it's not necessarily anybody to blame. It's just, that's how things go in one direction. And I think it's fascinating. That's why I asked the questions, because I'd like to hear your perspective on, you're giving a lot of praise and shout out for your local and provincial supports, which again, like all of the pieces in the K-12 education sphere, there's so many players and pieces involved. And when things are working the way they're supposed to, people feel really good. And there's an opportunity to flourish. But when one of those pieces isn't there, nobody's helping us with this or that or the other. So I like digging into what people see and feel around them. I got one last question, then I'll hit you with some quick ones. This one's always a tough one for people, but I don't mind asking that. You got to name one person in education that you're grateful for.
Wow. Narrowing it down is difficult.
Yeah.
I could name several. You really want me to just name one though, right?
Yeah. I know that's why people don't like this question, but that's why I like asking it, because it makes people have to. And again, full disclosure, if you say this person's name, obviously it doesn't exclude all the other dozens and dozens of people. It just happens to be this person.
Okay. The person that comes to mind is a guy named Steve Belaine. He was Assistant Director General at Lester Pearson School Board when I was in the role of Regional Director and some other roles that I held. He had a level of integrity that I would like to emulate at some point in my career. Very supportive, took a lot on, and just have a lot of respect for the individual. We still communicate by text every now and again, but had a probably more than he knows positive impact on my career moving forward.
That's often the case, that there's these people who, that's why I like asking this question, who maybe have no idea the degree of influence that they might have had on somebody. And it humbles us all to think, oh, there's lots of people. I think about my time as a teacher, all the thousands of things I've said, good and bad, that have had an impact on some kid. And I just go, oh my goodness, I hope I didn't say something terrible to this kid, which I'm sure I said something at some point that wasn't as good. But what you're calling out there is this positive impact that this Stephen might not even realize that he has had on you. So
yeah, I've shared it with him, but he probably doesn't realize the breadth and depth of that.
Fantastic.
Watching him work. Yeah.
Yeah. So you already touched on the fact that you are a voracious reader. Reading is a big part of who you are. And I recently had a guest on, Ainsley Rose, who actually called out, he said, you probably know Ainsley, said that one of the traits of being a great leader is to be a voracious leader, so a reader. So that you are, but what's on your current reading list right now?
Book I read really recently, just probably in January, I completed it. It's a book called Hope Circuits by Jessica Riddell. She's a professor at Bishop's University, and I followed up and had a conversation with her. She graciously accepted this cold call email, if you will, and we had an hour-long conversation. We may do some work with her in October in advancing this flourishing community work. The book is about kind of rewiring higher education. What are the systems that need to be surfaced? How do we create critical hope in shifting the organization, if you will, of higher education and service to community? And when I read it, I thought, you're very eloquently putting into words some of the things I'm thinking about, how we shift K-12 education right now, and what are some of the necessary steps we need to take. That led me to a book which I've just started called Critical Hope. And Michael Ungar's been on my reading list. Adam Kahane, who is also a Canadian who works in the international sphere of challenging and creating changes in systems. So I'm really into systems change right now, with another book that I'm currently reading called AI Wisdom by a guy named Tim Daisy, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he, in the first half of the book, situates neural networks, both human neural networks, machine neural networks, as well as existing networks in nature, how knowledge is collectively created. And then in the second part, what he's pointing towards is what that manifests like in AI. So it's been really interesting to understand AI from a different perspective, and how there's a lot of overlap, at least according to him, in terms of the way the human brain works to an extent. There's not direct 100% comparison here, and how AI is working, which helps you use it more effectively if you can understand some of those core learning principles. So that's what I'm reading right now, plus a book on urban normativity. I'm really interested in the concept of how do we promote and celebrate the rural advantage and start fighting, and I mean that diplomatically, of course, back against urban spread. Yeah. Those are the things I'm currently into.
Nice. Yeah. Excellent. That's a lot of stuff there. All right. So when you aren't fully immersed in these pretty heavy topics, I'm always interested. Do you have a little unwinding? Maybe you and your wife have a binge watch or something that you watch. It's just like, you mentioned Heartland. And I have to tell you a funny story about Heartland. So when I worked with Discovery, my boss, who's from Pennsylvania, was asking about the show called Heartland that his wife loves it. And it's 15 seasons. And I had to admit at that point, and I'm going back maybe 10 years, I'd never heard of the show.
Right.
I felt really that I hadn't, because he says it's taking place a province away from you. But anyway, so you mentioned Heartland, but what else? Do you have anything on your list of like shows or movies or things that capture your attention that gives you a little bit of a break from all of the things you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, recently we started watching Peaky Blinders. Was recommended to us years ago. Finally got around to it. Some other things that we watched are some of those Viking sagas. There's a historical fiction aspect to that I find interesting, similar to Peaky Blinders in terms of that context of England at that particular time in the Industrial Revolution. Not that you asked this. The other thing I do, though, is I build things, developing the basement right now, doing the electrical work, the framing, all of that kind of stuff, waiting for inspections. I find it does two things. It taps into a different way of thinking, and you also see the progress pretty tangibly of your work, whether it works out well or not. You see that progress. And so I appreciate immersing myself in that on the weekend because it
So
disconnects
different.
you from the people work entirely.
Yeah.
And it's a nice escape that way. And plus I learn things.
Good for you. Yeah. Last question. And I'm be curious with this one because you are a relative newcomer to the area.
Yeah.
I've always asked people for a hidden gem. So you can talk specifically about High River or the division at large. So what's a hidden gem of something a person should go check out? And it could be like anything from your local bakery or coffee shop or a hike or a park or just something you go like this. People should really check this out in the area. What would that be?
There's a really great coffee shop just across the street here and down the street, which is next to a really great diner. And those are places, if you come in a High River, I would definitely recommend you check out. Colossi's is the name of the coffee shop. The diner, the name is escaping me right now, but it's right next door, literally.
Right there.
You can't miss it. From an environmental standpoint, the pathways essentially that exist in the towns, whether it be Black Diamond or Diamond Valley, it's called now High River, Okotoks, there's an extensive pathway network that just immerses you in nature, even though you're in a suburb, and provides peace of mind if you want to go out with the family, go bike riding. They're hidden gems if you don't know how communities are built out in the southern Alberta area. There's big emphasis on getting into the outdoors. So
Nice.
those are the two things.
Thank you. Listen, it was great getting to know you and learning about your journey and what you're trying to do in Foothills. And I wish you all the best. And I know we'll stay connected in some way.
Yeah,
In fact, I know you and I both are attending the Mental Health Summit in Banff. So I'll see you there. We'll maybe sit down, have a coffee or a drink or something like that and keep the conversation going. But yeah, congratulations on the work you're doing in Foothills. I think it's the right work and I wish you all the best. And I'm here to support and give you a shout out, whatever you need.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate you also being open to me shooting you a message and saying, hey, maybe this is an opportunity. And I look forward to sitting down with you. Maybe we can share a meal and just talk more about all this stuff and see how we can continue to work together. That'd be great.
Sounds good.
Appreciate